So we've talked about people, and we've talked about how we stick them together and relate them to each other. Now let's talk about what these people do, and that means talking about activities. Activities are also very important in CYFS and in the NIEM as a whole. Now you can often tell an activity because an activity has a start and an end date. Most activities do. You start doing it and then you stop doing it, and that's the activity. Here's some examples from the CYFS domain. One is juvenile case. A juvenile case is a great example of a couple of things. First, it's an example of an activity, but it's also an example of something we don't often think of as an activity. We think of a case as being, maybe the case file, but it's really not. It's an activity that people go through. And the case starts and then eventually the case ends. Well, some don't. Some seem to go on forever, but generally the case ends. It's really an activity that people go through. Now you can see in a juvenile case, it contains things like the case referred agency, the caseworker, informal adjustments and informal dispositions, which are, they're like dispositions only without the same sense of criminality, of criminal justice to them. There's the juvenile. Remember, we saw the juvenile earlier, a whole bunch of things packed into the concept of the juvenile role, and then referral reason text. Now you may be thinking, that's not a whole lot of stuff. Where are some of the things more generic things about a case? Well, the thing is, the juvenile case is an enhanced version of the NIEM's own generic case. So we can see it also has things like category text, docket IDs, case filings, categories, resolutions, subcategories, a title, a tracking ID, and then a date for it. But there's still things missing. And that's because the NIEM's case object is an enhanced version of a generic activity object. And the activity object has things like the date and a category and a description and a disposition and a name, a reason, a status, an identification. So you wrap all that up together, and that's what you have in a juvenile case. A lot of different pieces of information that tell you details about this particular juvenile case activity. Another example would be the assessment object inside the CYFS domain. And again, that's an enhanced version of the NIEM's assessment object. And the NIEM's assessment object is more generic. And that in turn is an enhanced version of that same generic activity from the NIEM. And so assessment also has this large selection of detailed information about the assessment as an activity. Both the NIEM and the CYFS domain are absolutely loaded with activities, partially because a lot of things we think of as other stuff, like documents, actually become activities in the NIEM and in CYFS. Here's a quick list of all the CYFS-specific activities. So as you looked over that list of activities, you probably saw some that really look like documents to you. And it's a common misconception. A lot of things we view as documents are really just the records of an activity. Does that make sense? Here, take a look at this. So I thought I'd go outside and ride around a little bit and think about this document versus activity thing. Oh, hang on. Oh, I'm just pulled over. Being pulled over doesn't happen very often. Yeah, what can I do for you? So, what kind of contraption you got here? Contraption? Well, I'll have you know this is a recumbent trike. Oh, it's a recumbent trike, is it? Well, what about your safety helmet? Oh, well, the thing is I'm only like a foot off the ground and I've got 3 wheels. Wait, so hold it right there. Trying to save your life, son. Oh, great. Thanks. It's a traffic citation. Actually, this is quite apropos of what we've been talking about. Here's a citation, but really when we talk about the concept of a citation, we're talking about the whole activity that surrounds it. We're talking about from the time I'm pulled over for the infraction to the time I actually go and pay for this ticket, in this case for not wearing a regulation safety helmet. But the citation is actually that whole activity. It's not just this paper report that indicates parts of the activity. It's the whole thing. It's being pulled over, being given the citation, and then going off and paying for it somewhere else. And that's why citation is an activity, and a lot of the things we view as being documents are also activities. As you can see, there's plenty of examples of activities that look like documents but really aren't in both CYFS and in the justice domain, and indeed in the NIEM as a whole. So things like, recommendations. We think of recommendations as being a bunch of text. It's actually an object an activity object that has a whole bunch of things in it. Same with findings, same with bonds, citations, sentences, orders, verdicts, all those things we view as some sort of printed document, but in actuality are activities with start and end dates and are treated as such in both CYFS, Justice, and in the NIEM as a whole. So we've talked about a lot of objects. We've talked about people. We've talked about roles. We've talked about activities. We've talked about organizations. We've talked about relationships between people and objects. How do we really combine all this together? It's a whole lot of stuff. Let's take a look at an example of fitting some of these things together. And a good one for this community is to focus on school. So how do we deal with the idea of a student going to school? How do we capture all that information? Well, number one, we start with two simple objects, the school object and a person object. Our second step is to add relationships between those objects. So we have a school-student association that links the person to the school. Third step is to add a student role that provides the information specific to being a student that person has playing that role of a student. And then finally, we note that each of these objects on the screen is itself chock full of information. So each and every one of these has things inside of it. The school has organization types of things like its location and its name and a whole bunch of other things. The person has things specific to a person. In the context of education, they have goals and needs that go there, but they also have all sorts of person things, name, eye color, all the stuff we talked about long ago in this presentation. We've got the student role, which has things like grade level, descriptions of their current education status, an image of the student, their student identification, all sorts of things about them being a student, and then the association itself has a lot of information as well. Enrollment dates, why they may have withdrawn, if they've been expelled, and if so, the details of that, their GPA, their general performance, their schedule, which in turn includes class information, so you can even get down to the point of talking about individual classes. Don't show it on the screen. The screen gets way too busy, way too quick as you start to expand these things out. But we can capture pretty much any detail about this person attending this school via the association and via their student roles that are linking them together and being attached to them. And so it all fits together. Tons and tons of information that can all just be fit together to give us a good view and to capture the information about this. Another example would be the family example we looked at earlier, where we have all these different individuals and they're linked with family relationships. All we've done now in the diagram is change them to the actual names out of the CYFS domain, showing parent-child relationships and things like that. The CYFS domain is a wonderful place. We have lots and lots of things here for you to enjoy. But that doesn't mean we're the only place in town. We're not the only community. And our neighboring community, Justice, also has some awesome things of their own. In fact, some of them are so cool that we either borrowed or enhanced them for our own use. Let's talk about borrowing first, or more accurately, copying. There's a lot of neat things in Justice, and we took advantage of those neat things to make copies of them inside the CYFS domain. We see a few on the screen. For example, Justice has a charge, and our allegation is very similar to a charge. So we use the same structure of the charge, the same sorts of things inside a charge. Enforcement official? Yeah, Justice has an enforcement official. Guess what? Everything in there is exactly the same sorts of things we need for a school resource officer. It's the same kind of thing, only with a different name. Same with sentence, court events, incidents. You've got a generic incident. A delinquent act is the same kind of thing. So we just borrow the incident structure and use it for delinquent act. And the same for supervision. So these are all things we've copied from Justice. Now there's a whole ton more things in Justice you can go look at. We don't cover it here because this is not a guided tour to the Justice domain. But there are other resources available if you want to learn more about what's in the Justice domain. But sometimes things that are in the Justice domain are cool, but not exactly what we need. In other words, they're just not good enough for us, and we need to enhance them. Now, we saw an example of this early on when we talked about the juvenile case, and we talked about how the juvenile case is an enhanced version of the Justice case, which is in turn an enhanced version of the generic NIEM activity. And so what we do is we take objects that are close to what we want, but not quite good enough, and we add things to them. We enhance them. But juvenile case isn't the only example of this. And the other example is assessment. That was one we talked about earlier as well. There are other examples. Charge, for example. We take charge and we enhance it into a juvenile charge, adding some additional things about juvenile charges that the more generic charge doesn't have. Same thing with juvenile abuse and neglect allegation. That's an enhanced version of justice's charge. Judicial official is another example. We enhance that to our own attorney object. And we also enhance it to make a child welfare attorney object that has additional information specific to being a child welfare attorney. Instead of recreating things that are already available, we use things that are available from other domains, and if they're available, kind of what we need but not exact, we enhance them to make them exactly what we need.